Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Good morning. The economy was on the ballot. Did the debates and the rhetoric address the issues? Folks, welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they happen in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historical context in which most events take place. During each episode of the podcast, my guests and I, we have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between the broader historic context and the events in which they occur, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that impact the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is the economy. Were substantive economic policies presented to the American people during the election? My guest is a professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School in New York. He's the author of Capitalism Hits the Fan and Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, and a number of other books. And he's also the founder of Democracy at Work, Dr. Richard Wolff. And he's also one of my favorite analysts. Dr. Richard Wolff, welcome back, sir.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be talking with you again. I learn every time I talk to you, and I also want to say at the beginning how much I appreciate your courage in having the kinds of discussions that you do. And man, we need it more now than ever before.
Well, thank you. And it's people like you that engage with me that allow me to have these conversations. Otherwise, I'd be sitting here talking to myself. So thank you. Let me start with this. I was watching a presentation that you did. I think it was the night of or the night right after the election, and you said that one candidate presented fake economics and the other candidate provided nothing. Who did what, and why are their presentations bad economics?
Well, I'm glad you asked because it is so stark, it is so glaring that I'm always a little depressed when I watch how the mass media, people like you obviously accepted, but the mass media works so hard to cover it up. So let me get right to the part first of the fake economics. That's what I would call what Mr. Trump and the Republicans offer. And it's fake, but I want to give them credit. It's fake in the same way that glitzy Madison Avenue advertising is fake. You know, if they want you to buy a certain kind of soap, then up on the screen of your TV will come a beautiful young lady who is washing herself with this soap. And the message is, if only you use this soap, well, maybe you'll get the lady, or maybe your sex life will get a lot better. And we giggle when we see it because we can see right through it. All they want is for you to shell out the money to buy their particular brand of soap. All the rest is fake. Okay, here comes Mr. Trump, and let me show you how what he does is the same. He goes to the American people, and particularly the working class, the long-standing base of mostly the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party. And they know they have to make a dent there or else they will lose one election after another, as they did for most of the last 50 years. Okay, how are they going to do that? They figure out, because it doesn't take a genius, that the American working class has been suffering now for quite some time. Its wages don't go up, and even when they go up a little, prices go up even more, so they slip further and further behind. The American dream is out of reach. To go to college, which doesn't get you all that good a job in the first place, now means you have to go into debt for pretty much the rest of your life. I mean, it's a bad scene, and people who are honest know it. So they go, the Republicans, to the people in the working class who are suffering, who are fearful about their own job, their future, and Lord knows for their children. And they say, I have a candidate for you, Mr. Trump. He's going to protect you. Well, what the message is, he's going to protect you from all that ails you, all these economic problems, bad jobs, insecure jobs, jobs without benefits, no jobs for your children, and a retirement where you have to work as a greeter at Walmart or something like that. Well, he can't protect you from that. He has no policies to do that. It's going to be very hard for anyone to do that, given how much water is under that bridge. So he comes up with a substitute, just like a little teaser in the soap commercial, a substitute, a fakery, as if you're going to get the lovely young woman or you're going to get an improvement in your sex life. So what is Mr. Trump going to do to protect you? Well, he comes up with two big ones, and he hammers that at them for the entire election. Number one, he's going to protect you against, get ready, the invasion of the immigrants. And number two, he's going to protect you against the invasion of Chinese goods and services. Against the immigrants, he's going to put up a big steel wall. And against the Chinese products, he's going to put up a big tariff wall. Notice the nice wall imagery that can be repeated over and over to get the idea in. I'm your great protector, and I'm going to erect walls. Okay, now I'm going to put on my hat as an economist and tell you what economics this is about. So first, protect us from the immigrants? Well, let's go through it. According to the Homeland Security Department of the United States now has somewhere between 10 and 12 million undocumented people in our country, immigrants without the legal right to be here. Okay, let's see. Are 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants in any way imaginable the cause of our economic difficulties? And the answer is a 150% no. A student who wrote such a thing on an exam in an econ course would flunk. We are a nation of 330 million people, one of the richer nations in the world. 10 to 12 of the poorest people on the planet, immigrants trying desperately to get here, they are not enough to damage the American economy, which is why every time Mr. Trump or his minions said that stuff, they couldn't show a single thing about how they hurt the economy. So, for example, Mr. Trump had to make up they bring crime. The FBI statistics show that the immigrant population commits fewer crimes per person than the native-born American population does. So they can't talk about it, but they keep, because they have nothing in economics to suggest. Most of the immigrants are young people, working age, with or without children. Well, if they're working age and they go to work, they're pumping money into the Social Security system. That's what that system needs to be viable. If you actually deport them, which is what these really loony ones want to do, you're going to hurt the Social Security system upon which millions and millions of American families depend. It's economic nonsense. It makes no logical sense. The jobs that undocumented immigrants take are the jobs no native-born American wants to take. Why? Because they are the lowest paid. They are the worst condition. And the employers like the undocumented immigrants because of what they can do illegally to them. An employer who doesn't pay the immigrant on Friday afternoon when he's supposed to, what is the immigrant going to do? Go to the police? He's an undocumented immigrant. That would be giving himself a ticket out of the country. He'll be deported. He can't go to the authorities. It's the last place he'll ever go. So the employer knows that he has this person in a position he would never have a native-born American worker. So a native-born worker doesn't know the conditions under which, if he were really sensitive to the situation, he'd want there to be an enforcement, a real one, of the laws that have been developed over 2 centuries in this country to protect workers, to make sure that the immigrant is protected as well, so that there's no incentive to replace an American with an immigrant because you can abusively and illegally exploit him. In any case, the bottom line, protecting us from immigrants is fake. And now here comes the second one. Protecting us from China. I love this. For the last 30 years, you and I know, and everyone watching this program knows, that we have been substituting Chinese-made goods for goods that come from other parts of the world. Whether we shop at Walmart or Target or anywhere else, our clothing, our appliances, you name it, we get them from China. You know why? Because they were cheaper. The quality was good and the price was amazing. Walmart will be the first one to tell you that the way they got to be the biggest retailer in America was because they got on the train from China first, and they could deliver to the American people incredibly cheap stuff in the Walmart, bringing the business to them. You know, in economics, what that means? It means we have enjoyed no inflation for the last 30 years until recently because of China. They're the ones who allowed Americans to have a standard of living that they could afford. Recently, China having arrived at the status of being America's first real economic competitor, it is no longer willing to do what it once did. So it wants to get paid decent prices. It wants its working class to have a decent standard of living. And they've been giving their workers real wage increases over the last 30 years, far above what the United States has been willing to do in terms of increasing. So here's the joke. When you put a tariff on a Chinese good, which is what Mr. Tariff says Mr. Trump has said he's going to do.
Same thing. Mr. Tariff, Mr. Trump, same thing.
Mr. Trump, right. They really are becoming the same. I pardon my mistake. In any case, here's how it works. Because Mr. Trump was fond of saying, I'm going to hit the Chinese with a tariff. You may put a tariff in, Mr. Trump, but hitting the Chinese, you're not going to do. Because tariff is just a word to apply to a tax. It's the name of a particular tax. And I want everyone to understand this Republican is proposing a massive program of taxing us. And why do I say us? because a tariff is paid by the American company that brings any good produced overseas into the country. When you do that, and only Americans do that, when you do that, you pay a tax to Uncle Sam. So the cost is to the American importer. And guess what? He's going to pass that cost onto you and me as the final consumers. So the tariff will mean our prices go up because our importers are paying Uncle Sam. You're not hitting the Chinese, you're hitting us. But if you want to pretend you're the big protector, like if you want to pretend that soap commercial is all about your sex life, okay, well, then you can fall for this nonsense. Mr. Trump did a very clever thing. I'm going to protect you. And people said, yes, I need it. And I'm going to do the walls. Well, they didn't pay all that much attention. They heard about the protection. They don't perhaps know clearly why the wall stuff is nonsense. But I'm here to tell you, it was pure advertising, Madison Avenue fluff. There was no substance to it. The reason, this is the real punchline, the reason American producers who used to have factories in Chicago or St. Louis or Rochester or wherever moved to China was because it was more profitable. They could get away with paying workers much less, and they had the biggest growing market in the world. They made the decision to move. The Chinese didn't make that decision. They did. If you really want to not make that happen, then you have to interfere with the free enterprise decision-making of corporate CEOs. And Mr. Trump doesn't say one word about that this time. You know, he played with it in 2016, but he didn't play with it this year. He knew he had to reassure the business community, don't worry, I'll tell the masses whatever it is I need to tell them. I won't touch you.
A couple of things that come to mind as I listen to you. One, on the immigration point, both sides of the argument talked about the wall. Neither side talked about why are these people coming to the country in the first place.
Right.
Nobody talks about American foreign policy in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Nicaragua, in Guatemala. Nobody talks about, even though Vice President Harris was the border czar, nobody talks about the impact that American foreign policy in these countries, decimating these economies for decades. Quick example, Chiquita Brands was just convicted in federal court in Florida of backing death squads in Colombia, and now has to pay millions of dollars to these impacted families. Well, if Chiquita Brands, Chiquita Banana, for those that don't put the two together, if Chiquita Brands is backing death squads in Colombia, where are these targeted Colombians supposed to go for respite, refuge, and protection? You look at the United States trying to reinvade Haiti. We're paying Kenya to be the black face on American imperialism. Where are these Haitians supposed to go? As the United, and by the way, it was Vice President Harris that was championing that policy, and Linda Thomas Greenfield in the UN trying to convince all of us we need to reinvade Haiti. Your point about China, the deindustrialization of America, that's our fault. We did that to ourselves. And folks, imagine this. It's cheaper to make whatever in China and ship it back here than to make it here in the first place. That's the logic. And the final point, well, I never heard Vice President Harris articulate any of this in a rebuttal to Donald Trump. So you said Trump was fake, she was nothing. in terms of analysis and policy, Professor Wolff?
Okay, I'm going to begin like a good son by quoting my mother. My mother said, "You can't fight something with nothing." And by nothing, I mean pretty much what you just said. Kamala Harris, who, obviously is better than Mr. Trump. I'll say it because people sometimes imagine that I don't know that or see it. But nothing comparable. There was no big, flashy, attention-grabbing alternative. It was a lot of me too. See, I'm against immigration too, and I'm against the Chinese too.
Well, and I grew up in Oakland, middle class, and we had a very nice front yard.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, it's sad. I kept watching, hoping that somebody would get to her among her advisors and tell her, you can't fight something with nothing. You've got to come up with a plan that is dramatic and powerful and could solve the problem, and then make fun of him because he's not going to solve anything. He's sitting there right now, I assure you, trying to figure out with his advisors, I can't hit the Chinese with tariff. That'll give us an inflation. And the inflation is half the reason why people voted for me, against the Democrats. I can't risk doing that. And if I throw 10 million undocumented immigrants out of the country, what are all the employers of those immigrants going to do? They're going to have to pay American citizens much, much more money, and they're going to raise all their prices. We're going to have an inflation. I can't have that. Yeah, but you promised it. Now you're in a pickle. And I don't know how he's going to get himself out of that hole that he dug himself in. But the Democrats, they had nothing else. I mean, my goodness, we're going to give $25,000 to families who are going to, for the first time, buy a house. Very nice. Who's going to oppose it? But, it's a small story on the edge of today's headlines. Ditto, if not, you're going to not tax people's tip income and stuff like that.
Wait a minute. Let me interrupt you on that $25,000 for two things. One, was that a talking point or a policy? And the other thing is, who's going to pay for it? If you're sending $8 billion to Ukraine, $8.7 billion to Israel, and you're sending $600 million to Taiwan, that's $17 billion in a week. Just in 1 week. If you're sending that much of our money there, how are you going to pay for that? And wouldn't that just also inflate the price of a house by $25,000?
Absolutely would raise the price of the house. Okay. Everything you say is correct. But let's be fair to Kamala Harris. Okay. Neither she nor Trump explained how they would pay for anything. And they certainly are not going to stop funding the wars. Unfortunately, they seem to agree on the wars. Trump, hinting he might not do it for Ukraine, but eager to show he'll back up Israel, which is, in the long run, a hopeless situation for the United States. And Kamala Harris pushing for both wars. She's carrying the legacy of Biden's war in Ukraine, and it dares not be critical of the U.S. position in Israel. That would have been the kind of big splashy thing. I am going to stop the war and use the money to do. That would have captured people's attention. Let me give you another example, because this is not complicated. Suppose she said, what we need today is what Franklin Roosevelt did in the 30s. We need a massive program of government intervention in the economy, a program to hire all the unemployed. We are going to create an economy that guarantees a job. And you know what? We have the resources, especially if we stop these wars. We have the resources to hire every American citizen first for a guaranteed job at a decent income, and then, and hold your breath, we're going to give jobs to the immigrants too. And you know why? Because we don't want a country divided between the native born and the immigrants. We actually take seriously the Christian and many other religious traditions which say you're supposed to welcome the immigrant, the one who's suffering, into your home, the way people welcomed, Joseph and Mary and all the rest of the story, right? I'm going to do that. We're going to have a Marshall Plan and a New Deal, and we are going to overcome all the bitterness in our country by saying everybody has a guaranteed job. We should have done it long ago. We were on the way in the 1930s. We got waylaid, and I'm bringing it back. Wow. She would have drawn down on herself the imagery of the FDR, which was the president who brought the Democratic Party to the labor movement and put them together. I mean, that was more the work of the labor movement than it was of Mr. Roosevelt as president. But nonetheless, she would have been heroic. You know who could have done it too? And I hate to admit it because I didn't used to think it. But Mr. Sanders, it's the kind of thing he might have done. And, maybe he should have sat down with Kamala Harris and worked out a big, splashy program. And if people had said, you may not get that done. People said that about Mr. Trump's immigration nonsense. And they've been telling him about the tariff nonsense. I have colleagues that are friends of mine who are economists. They're not on the same political wavelength I am, but the people I work with and know. And they've been advising Trump, you can't do any of this. And his advisors say back to them, it's not about what we can do. It's about winning the election. And we're going to do that. And they did. And now the chickens are going to come home, and we are all going to live through how much of that nonsense he tries before he figures out what even some of his advisors have been telling him, that, yeah, it was good to win an election, and you got to drop it like a stone now, because otherwise it'll take you down with it.
A couple of things. I've just published a piece, folks. You can find it at popularresistance.org, Requiem for a Failed Campaign and Party. And in it, I say that one of the big problems that Donald Trump stuck with his base. Kamala Harris ran from the base instead of gladly accepting the endorsement of Dick Cheney. She should have been campaigning with Bernie Sanders. Instead of traversing the trail with Liz Cheney, she should have been with Elizabeth Warren. And I say to people all the time, Joe Biden wasn't nominated in 2020 to beat Donald Trump. He was nominated to beat Bernie Sanders.
Right. No, I could not agree more. I mean, to be fair, again, I want to be fair to Kamala Harris. Running away from the working class has been a Democratic commitment ever since the Clintons, at least in my judgment. The Clintons came to the top of the Democratic Party and pushed out the old leadership that felt, even someone as bad in other ways as Lyndon Johnson. He too came out of the Democratic Party post Great Depression. He knew that their base was that working class. The Democratic Party, I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples. The federal minimum wage in the United States remains, as I speak with you now, at $7.25 an hour. Every worker listening to this program knows you cannot live on $7.25 an hour almost anywhere in the United States. When was it last raised by the Congress? Answer, 2009. Okay, we've had 15 years since then. In every one of those years, prices rose. In some years, only by 1 or 2%. In bad years, 7, 8, 9%. But every year the prices rose. Did we raise the minimum wage for the poorest of the poor workers among us? Answer, no. And that was under Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, under Congresses controlled by the Republican Party and Congresses controlled by the Democratic Party. That is a fundamental immorality. What kind of a country over the last 15 years savages the poorest among them by not raising the minimum wage at least at the rate of inflation? What in the world? It means that people living on $7.25 an hour could afford less and less year in and year out. I mean, it is really disgusting. And of course, a working class suffering that, and I don't have to remind you, it's not just millions of people who get the minimum wage. It's millions of people whose wages are pegged to the minimum wage. Here's what that means. In this job, we pay $2 above minimum, or we pay $3 above minimum. So if the minimum were raised, everybody else's would be raised a little too. So all of those people have been screwed. And of course, they're the ones at the bottom half of our country. That's what we have been doing. And of course, since those people watch that whether it's Republicans or Democrats, they're not being taken care of. They're not the priority. Their situation keeps deteriorating. They're not going to feel particularly warm or loyal to the Democratic Party. And if a splashy character like Mr. Trump, full of Madison Avenue glitz and golden toilets, comes by, well, why not give him a shot? It's not as though you're giving up anything, because the people you used to vote for, or that your mother and father always voted for, have abandoned you, or at least so it seems. And they are quite right to feel that way. And what Kamala Harris should have done is recognize, not her fault, recognize what previous Democrats have been doing all these years, at least 30 years, and said, I got to break from that, or else that's going to take me down. She didn't break from it, and it took her down.
Cherie says, Dr. Richard Wolff and Professor Wilmer Leon, great team. And Cherie, thank you. And you're right. Africa Unite 27 asks, how many cars did Tesla sell? And my calculation shows about 7 million, that Tesla, as of this month, has sold about 7 million cars. I want to tie that to a point you make about Trump and his tariffs, particularly on Chinese electric vehicles, because you have said, and I think you're right, that China makes one of, if not the best electric vehicle at about $30,000 a car. So I'm wondering if Trump's threat on electric vehicles from China and the guy that runs Tesla,
Elon
Musk's contributions to Trump are a hedge of being sure that Chinese vehicles don't make it to American shores.
Yeah, well, we will learn what Mr. Musk purchased. And before I answer your particular question, let me just say, around the world, Americans don't know about this, but I read foreign newspapers all day, every day.
As do I.
And around the world, this spectacle of Mr. Musk dancing around with Mr. Trump and giving away $1 million to voters in Pennsylvania in order to, it's making the old joke that we in America have the best government money can buy into a reality and no longer a funny joke. It is the government that money buys. Mr. Musk is the symbol, the richest man, and he's buying the American presidency because it's for sale by a professional salesman. Now, let me answer the question about China's vehicles, because not only is it a wonderful lesson in itself, but you should understand that what I'm about to tell you about Chinese cars is true for many, many more products, and will be even truer than that for still more products in the years ahead. Starting about 10 or 15 years ago, a global competition began. Who is going to produce and build the next generation of automobiles to be fueled not by gas, oil or fossil fuels, but to be fueled instead by electricity? Okay? We all know that the big famous breakthrough was associated with Tesla, but they were not the only ones ever, and they're not the only ones now. Chinese automobile companies, of which there are a bunch, also tried to do it. Everybody could see it's the future of the automobile and probably also the truck. And those are central to modern economies. Well, the competition is now over, and we can announce the winner. It's been known for several years, just not in the United States. The name of the company it has three initials. B as in boy, Y as in the color yellow, and D as in dog. The BYD Corporation. Memorize it, because it's going to be part of your future. They produce the best electric vehicles at the lowest price among those in China and among those worldwide, including Tesla. But here's the problem. If the world could, it would stop buying everybody else's cars and trucks, because, as I said, the ones coming from BYD are the best quality and the lowest price, which is the usual competitive winner. If you were to go right now, as we're talking, to Europe, you would find BYD cars all over the highways. Why? Because they have a tariff, but it's around 25%, going up to the 30s, which is a big tariff.
Mm-hmm.
But so cheap are these wonderful Chinese cars that the Europeans will pay the extra 30% to their own governments to be able to get them, because a better car, and even after the tariff, cheaper than what they can get there. We have none of them in the United States. Nobody that in this audience, unless you're very unusual and traveled, has even seen a BYD car. Why? Well, we had a 28% tariff, and then Joe Biden, all by his lonesome, raised it to, get ready, 100%. That means that if a car coming from China costs $30,000, one of these new electric cars or trucks, an American who wanted to buy it would have to pay $30,000 going to China to pay for the vehicle, plus another $30,000, 100%, to Uncle Sam as a tax, called a tariff. So it would cost an American 60 grand, not 30, 60. And so no American is going to do that, because you can buy a locally made Tesla or an electric car produced by GM or Ford or the others. And how much do they cost? 40 grand, 45, 50, a lot more than what it would cost to buy a Chinese for a less good car. But that's the way the cookie crumbles. Now, let me explain why that is an awful situation for the United States. It's good for General Motors and Ford. They can sell inferior cars at a higher price only because of that tariff. So it's good for them. Mm-hmm. But for you and me and most of America, it's awful. And the explanation for that is simple. Take any American producer company, let's say it's one that makes, I don't know, screwdrivers, a company in Cincinnati that makes screwdrivers. What does it do?
Craftsman tools.
Good, yeah, tools, any kind of tools.
Craftsman, they come from Sears. Craftsman tools.
Perfect. So they need, as part of their production of these tools, they need trucks, they need cars. They buy them as inputs into the production process for these tools. Now they are switching to electric because of all the reasons we do that. But they can't buy Chinese. It makes no sense for them. They're not going to spend 60 grand. So they're going to spend 40 grand, 45 grand, 50 grand for an inferior car. The competitor who produces tools in Asia, Africa, Latin America, or Europe can buy the better quality Chinese BYD electric car or truck at a lower price. And you know what? That's going to translate into their succeeding competitively selling their tools, because they can charge less for their tools because they pay less for the electric cars and trucks they use. This is America shooting itself in the foot, profiting the big corporations, the Elon Musks buttering up the politician. And I use buttering up because it's more polite than the other word. Using their clout, good for them, but for the rest of us, terrible. Millions of Americans will lose their jobs because their employer can't compete with others around the world who are able to buy the best electric vehicles at the lowest price. And now remember what I said. It's only one example. It's not just electric cars. It's all kinds of other equipment, including the highest tech telecommunications, where the Chinese compete with us as well. We are losing these competitions. American capitalism is being outcompeted by the Chinese, and no amount of BS is going to forever cover that up.
And Chika in London, I believe, thank you for that super sticker. She asks, what can be done to make the U.S. working class vote for their long-run material interests? Republicans exacerbate their immersion, but get votes. I think immersion. I'm missing that word. But anyway, what can be done to make the U.S. working class vote for their long-run material interests?
Well, I mean, the best answer I know how to give is there have to be...
Oh, immiseration. That's the word.
Immiseration, right.
Yeah, that's the word.
Right. The American working class knows it's being immiserated. They know that their standard of living is under attack.
Mm-hmm.
Look, it used to be that American wages more or less kept up with the prices of things they had to buy and with their productivity. In other words, what they gave to the employer through their work was compensated by a wage that went up together with how productive they were. Starting around the 1970s, that stopped. American capitalists moved their businesses out of the United States to parts of the world where they could pay much less in wages. They made a ton of profits. The country they went to the most, ironically, People's Republic of China. And they went there not to do the Chinese any favor, but because it was the most profitable place to be. You know, capitalism has always been mobile. It started in New England here in the United States, and then it abandoned New England and went to the Midwest. Then it abandoned the Midwest. We call it the Rust Belt because of that, and went to the Southwest and the South. And now, in the last 40, 50 years, it left the United States altogether. The American working class feels abandoned by the capitalist class because it was. They feel alienated from those people. They hate those people because they feel they made the decision that hurt the working class. And they're exactly right. The trick of the Republicans and the Democrats has been, how do you hold on to the votes of people when you are the two parties who celebrate the capitalist system that betrayed that working class? So that's why they have to come up with the theatric, I'm protecting you from the immigrant. Not my problem.
Mhm.
I'm protecting you from the Chinese. Not my problem. My problem is you guys, you corporate executives. So my answer to Chica's question is, you've got to have a political party running around the United States with articulate men and women explaining to the people, you're right to feel the way you do. You're not wrong. You're not stupid. You're not uneducated. You got it. You figured it out. But you're not clear on where the problem lies. You know what the problem is. What you don't know is where it lies. And then the working class, it'll come back and it'll surprise us. And it'll say, you don't give us very much credit. We know that the corporate leaders are the ones making the decision, but nobody is willing to take them on. That's why the polls show in the United States, even now, that the most popular nationally known politician is Bernie Sanders, who didn't even run anymore, because he's viewed as one of the very few who's willing to tell the story the way it ought to be told, to point the finger where it ought to be pointed. If we have more Bernies, if the likes of, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and the others have the courage, if they do, to stand up and make these arguments, I think you'll see a swerving of the American working class back to the left, every bit as strong, if not stronger, than the swerve to the right, which was mostly because the left looked like it abandoned the working class, just like the corporate sector had already done.
Crow, Memico 83 talks about the economy, and we keep hearing how well the economy is doing. In fact, the Wednesday after the election, they talked about the economy went up like gangbusters. But talk about just a little bit about the difference between the financialized side of the economy, which is what they're always talking about, versus the real economy. And it's that real economy, I believe, that was one of the elements that cost Vice President Harris the election.
I agree with you. However, let me push back just a little bit. And here I fault the combination of political leadership, economic leadership, academic leadership, and the mass media, who are engaged in a practice that psychologists call denial.
Mm-hmm.
Our economy is not in good shape. The mass of people who say so in poll after poll are not people who are stupid or not paying attention, that is just, besides insulting, it's just wrong. And let me give you just a few very hard examples. And I'm here going to use the numbers, the statistics of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, well reputed around the world, part of the West, very pro-capitalist and all of that. Okay, they keep track of how fast economies are growing, which is a measure of economies' strength. This year, 2024, is far enough along that the IMF has issued its final calculation of how much growth there will be in the United States economy in 2024. Answer, 2.8%. And so a lot of newspapers, I'm talking Wall Street Journal, New York Times, we are doing great. 2.8% is faster than any other industrial advanced country. That's wrong. I mean, that's not a question of fact that might be disputed. That's a question of, dare I say it, lying. Maybe they mean any other European country. Then it would be true. The United States at 2.8% is better than the Europeans these days. And that's mostly because the robust German economy is in deep trouble. But now let me tell you what the
wait a minute. The German economy is in deep trouble because the United States, having blown up the Nord Stream pipeline, intentionally deindustrializing the German economy.
That's right. When we put sanctions on Russia, as well as that pipeline story, when we put sanctions on Russia and said you can't sell oil and gas anymore, we're going to cripple your economy and destroy the ruble because Russia depended on oil and gas sales to Europe, which it did. They didn't understand that that would mean that the price of energy to Germany, which for 40 years had been relying on super cheap oil and gas from Russia, which was the cause of the so-called German miracle. Germany was the engine of progress in Europe because it got cheap energy from Russia and sold everything to China. Now they can't get the cheap energy from Russia anymore, and China doesn't need them. They are in very deep doo-doo. Right now, as we speak, they have a recession. They're one of the worst performing countries in all of Europe. They used to always be the best. Yeah, they are a victim of the Ukraine war. And as the United States' major European ally, that ought to worry Americans. But of course, we deny it all. Let me tell you what the IMF says is the rate of growth of the People's Republic of China this year. Is it below 2.8%, the American growth rate? No, it's 4.8%, nearly double. Oh my goodness. And India, the rate of growth there is 7%, almost 3 times. And these are not unusual. For most of the last 30 years, China has grown 2 to 3 times faster than the United States, which is why it has now caught up. Let me give you one more statistic. Until 10, 15 years ago, the world economy that came out of World War II, so going back to 1945, was a world economy dominated by the United States. Around the world, it is called the era of the American Empire, replacing the British Empire. Americans, you, me, most of the people listening or watching this program grew up at a period of the growth of the American Empire across the second half of the 20th century. But I got news for you. Like every other empire in the history of the world, it goes up and then it goes down. 10, 15 years ago, we peaked. We are now going down. The United States and its major allies, known around the world as the G7, the group of 7, the United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. Those together used to be the overwhelming bulk of the world economy. Today, they account for about 28 or 29%. On the other hand is China and its allies, known as the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. The BRICS now account for 35%. Americans don't understand. We're already number 2, not number 1.
And don't forget the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as another element.
That's right. They're building their alliances.
And to that point, why has BRICS developed to the degree that it has? Why has the SCO developed? Because in response to reckless, feckless American sanctions, those countries have decided we're going to do this another way, and we're going to do it off the dollar. We're going to do it without you.
That's right. And Americans who keep denying this, when I can't tell you that I go around the United States, I explain, I give them these basic numbers from impeccable sources. And they look at me in the audience, a little bit with those faces like puppies,
right,
that have done the wrong thing on the family rug, and they kind of know it, and everybody's upset with them. And they're kind of sad. They don't want me to say it, but they know what I'm saying. I didn't make it up. It's not my style, and I look like a reasonable person, which I am. And I tell them this, and I say, you got to deal with this. You can't pretend anymore. You're making terrible mistakes. When the United States decided to have this war in response to Russia's invading Ukraine, and that the great way to do it with sanctions, and that they would sanction the Russians and sanction everybody doing business with the Russians, and and the Russians would collapse and the ruble would disappear. None of that happened.
Right.
Russia is growing faster than the U.S. now. Also, the ruble went up and down like it always did, but nothing. Why? Because they didn't understand, which they should have, is no secret, that what the Russians would do if they can't sell their oil and gas to Germany and Europe would be to turn around and offer it to China and India, who said, of course, we'll take it all. And they did. And so the Russians did fine, and they had all the money they needed to pursue the war, which they have now won. I mean, what other lessons do you need to get before you realize you are going the wrong way down a one-way street that's pointing the other way?
Chica, once again, thank you for that super sticker. And folks, we could really appreciate the likes. That always helps. Do you think that an expanded safety net could reduce the political economic instability in the U.S., or is quote unquote welfare too demonized?
Good question. Easy answer. The demonization of welfare always requires immense lying about welfare. In other words, you want to get that. Remember that a few years ago, the welfare mom driving the Cadillac down the street, right?
Thank you, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. You have to come up with that. It's just, and why do you have to come up with that kind of a fakery? Because welfare is, you allow it to be defined as somehow crooked, or somehow being abused by people who aren't working. The statistics show that it's nothing of the sort. First of all, Social Security should be understood as a kind of welfare. Of course it is. What are you talking about? It's a decision made to do something for people who aren't working anymore, to give them an amount of money every month as a decent retirement. That was it was a commitment, a moral commitment of a population to its own elderly parents, for God's sake. It's a kind of welfare. When a family takes care of its children, the family, is giving the children welfare. The parents are taking a portion of their salary and their wages and feeding and clothing and sheltering their children. They don't demand payment from the children. That would be nutty. They are not going to punish the children because they're children, because that would be even crazier. So we give welfare, or we can call it that. Here's an irony for you to think about. The states that are most hostile to welfare in the United States, and I'm here talking mainly about the South, but there are other parts too, are the ones that get the most amount of government funding. It's a joke. It's the people on welfare who are driven by propaganda to demonize what they depend on. This is nutty. With a little bit of systematic education as to what welfare is and what motivates it and what its gains are, everybody would support it. And here's my proof. When was welfare as we modern know it put into effect? In the 1930s. That's when Social Security began. Before the 1930s, the Great Depression, when the government had no money and everybody was unemployed and nobody was paying taxes and you couldn't afford anything, the government, in the middle of that situation, decided to give everyone 65 years of age and older a decent pension for so long as they are alive. Wow. Where was all the argument that we can't afford it? Welfare is terrible. We shouldn't give these people money. There wasn't any. The mass of the people loved it. Then they gave another kind of welfare, an unemployment check. You lose your job, we're going to give you money every week for a year or so to help you through it. It's a kind of welfare. And then we passed the minimum wage. We never had any of these things before. All of them in the depths of the Depression. And then we had a government jobs program, again, in the depths of the Depression. And now for those of you who don't understand, where did the money come from to give this enormous amount of welfare? It didn't come from the government itself because it had no money. The Great Depression meant tens of millions out of work. They're not paying taxes because they don't earn anything. Corporations were dead in those years. They didn't pay anything either. So what did the President Roosevelt do? How did he get the money to give the American people all that welfare? Answer, he taxed corporations and the rich in the middle of a depression. He did that? Yeah, he did that. And you know what his reward was? As the only president to dare such a pro-welfare program, he was reelected president 3 times. He was the most popular president this country ever had. He was so popular that when he died in 1945, at the end of World War II, the Republicans rammed through a law that nobody can be more, no president can serve more than 2 terms because they didn't want to have to deal with another Roosevelt. So when people say, what will it take? My answer is, I'm not going to give you a speculation. I don't have to. I just have to remind you of our history. We've been there. We've done that. We can give the mass of people welfare on a massive scale. And you know what they'll give us? 3 elective victories in a row for president. We need a candidate with the courage to do it. We didn't have one this last time, and we haven't had one for a long time. And that's the reason we don't have that kind of politics. We have the corporate sector was very smart. After the death of Roosevelt and the end of World War II, they went on a tear, the corporate sector, to control this government, to control the media, to undo what the New Deal had done. They don't ever want to see another Roosevelt. And you know why they work so hard at it? Because they understand also it's lurking right there. And when the working class figures that out, oh boy, watch out. But we're waiting. We're all waiting. But no one should have the illusion that a massive increase in welfare would be some necessary mistake. No, 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 no. Quite the opposite.
In fact, to your point, that was the whole basis of the Powell memo, Lewis Powell telling corporate America they need to get deeper involved in politics to control it. We've got a question here from Joda. I don't know how to pronounce this, but Joda, can I ask you what you think of Slavoj Zizek and his opinion regarding Ukraine? Before you do that, let me answer by saying anybody that claims to be of sound mind and body that talks about we owe Ukraine full support, and to do this, we need a stronger NATO, is either selling you, as they say in the country, a pig in a poke, doesn't understand history, doesn't understand why the conflict in Ukraine was started in the first place, and is just presenting to you misinformation, disinformation, and a Western narrative so that the U.S. will continue to pour money down that empty rabbit hole and more Ukrainians can meet their peril.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, Wilmer. That
Okay.
you
Okay.
put your finger, but a couple things.
Okay.
A wise journalist, I don't remember who it was, but a wise journalist, I believe, was the first one to say the following: the first casualty in every war is the truth. And keep that in mind, that the first casualty of the war in Ukraine was the truth. The Russians put out their version of what happened and why, and the Ukrainians and the British and the Americans put out their version. Are there grains of truth in each of them? Yeah. Is there lots of propaganda in each of them? Yeah, you bet. It is a sad reality, but you can't pretend otherwise. At the end of World War II, the history is always the guide here. At the end of World War II, a deal was made between Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, meeting in Yalta and several other European cities. They would defeat the Germans, which they did, end the war, which they did, and develop what they called an architecture of peace and security in Europe. The western part of Europe would stay the way it was: France, Germany, the Low Countries, Britain, Spain, Italy, and so forth. Then there would be an Eastern European strip from the Baltic states in the north through to Bulgaria in the south. A buffer zone, if you like, of countries that would be neither east nor west. They would protect Russia from future invasions from the west. And let me remind everyone about Russian history. Russia was invaded in the 18th and 19th century devastatingly by Napoleon. Devastating. In the 20th century, they were invaded in World War I and again in World War II. They were devastated since much of the war was fought on their land, devastating their people. More Russians were killed in the two world wars than any other nationality. Far more.
And couldn't have won World War II without Russia. We never make that statement, that without the Russian sacrifice in World War II, the United States would not have been the victor.
Absolutely. And I also want to remind people, because they don't know, that after the Russian Revolution that brought the socialists there into power, that happened in 1917, led by Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, the United States was one of 4 countries that sent troops into Russia to fight against the new socialist government. Britain, France, Japan, and the United States. The U.S. sent 10,000 troops who fought against the Soviet government in that country. No Russian troops ever landed in the United States to fight against an American government. Only the other way around. Who threatens whom? But all of that is ancient history.
Mm-hmm.
When Russia, the Soviet system, collapsed in 1989, the Russians became, of course, very worried. What would happen to the Eastern European buffer zone? Because they knew that it didn't take capitalism versus communism to get Russia invaded. Napoleon didn't have anything to do with that. First World War, there was no socialism versus capitalism at play in the war. And there wasn't much of that in World War II because the United States and Soviet Union were allies in World War II. So the Russians got worried and they received assurances. That's what they say.
Mhm.
I don't see much reason to doubt it. It makes perfect sense that cordon, that buffer zone would be protected, would be respected. Well, over the last 20 years, it wasn't.
Mhm.
NATO expanded. It one after another, from Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in the north to Bulgaria in the south. They were moved one by one into NATO. They became part of the West, now right up against the border of Russia.
And wait a minute, and Secretary of State Jim Baker, in I think it was 1991, promised Gorbachev, if you allow for the reunification of East and West Germany, I guarantee you, and thank you, Kevin Baptiste, for that super sticker, I guarantee you NATO will not move any further eastward towards the Soviet Union. And France agreed, Germany agreed, Britain agreed. They all backed Baker's play. Please allow us to unify East and West Germany, and NATO will not move any further eastward. That's why when Biden and Putin met in Geneva in July of 22, I think it was 22, no, 21, leading up to the conflict, Putin told Biden, I'm giving you my security demands in writing, and I expect to see a response from you to my demands in writing, because he wanted on paper what Baker had promised verbally. And when Biden ignored him, that to me was the final point. Was the Putin said, well, you're not going to listen to me. Now I got to show you.
Yeah, I mean, and even people who want to dispute any of this with factual suggestions, the point is whether or not a formal agreement was made. The Russians have watched for 20 years
Right.
as their buffer zone became part of their adversary. And it was a matter of time because Putin said it over and over again. We can't continue to allow it. And when finally the question was raised early in this century, I think 2005 or 6, well, now we would like to see Ukraine join NATO too. Well, I mean, that's the biggest single chunk.
Right.
Eating right. If you look at the geography, right into the heart of Russia, of course they're going to do something. Now they did it. Okay.
And wait a minute. And here's a practical reality to that point. If they allowed Ukraine to become part of NATO, or not allowing Ukraine to be part of NATO, but just put the missiles there, that cuts Putin's response time to any threat from like 12 minutes down to 6, which means he now has to what they call launch on warning. He has no time to pick up the phone and call Joe and say, hey, Joe, did you just send a missile my way? Or is this a glitch in the computer screen? No, they got to hit that button. When the computer says incoming, they have to respond. There's no time to discuss it. Launch on warning. And that's happened. We've come close to that happening twice, I want to say, in about the last 25 years, that they almost went to launch on warning and they didn't.
Yeah, and a rational America wouldn't want that situation either. Because
right.
if anyway, here's the point I would make.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, not at all. The point I would make is the view of the Russians is their national security is at stake. You don't have to agree with them. They see it their way,
Right.
but you have to come to terms with them. And the West has to decide, really, do you want on this point to risk a nuclear war? I mean, are you for real? I mean, I understand how easy it is for the United States to fight to the last Ukrainian. All of the damage here is being done over there. But do you really want to do this? Well, they said, yeah, because we're going to destroy Russia in the process. Well, that was wrong. You didn't. You have to face up to the fact you made a colossal misjudgment here.
Yes.
And what else are you missing out on? You ought to think about that.
Exactly.
And whatever our government does, and many of them are lost. These are people who fought the Cold War for 40 years. They're still in that mindset. For them, the world is still communism versus capitalism, even though that's all irrelevant now. No, that's what they're still fighting the same old Russia.
And that's the Brzezinski. That's the Brzezinski mindset, which Madeleine Albright is a Brzezinski acolyte. Yeah. Hillary Clinton, Madeleine Albright was. She's no longer with us. Hillary Clinton was a Brzezinski acolyte, and we know that Vice President Kamala Harris is a Hillary Clinton acolyte. So Scott Ritter was right when he said on the show a couple of days ago, if Harris had won, he said we'd be in World War III in 6 months.
Yeah, I mean the horror of it is that they don't get it, which is why I hammer at it as an economist. We, the United States. I'm born in Ohio. I've lived and worked here all my life. We are not what we were in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
It's done.
At the prime of the Cold War, that's gone. It's not just Soviet Russia that disappeared. The whole nature of the situation disappeared. The BRICS, centered around the People's Republic of China, has all the high tech in the world, the fastest communications on the internet, telecommunications here, there, and they are doing the same thing in their military. But here's an important difference, friends. The BRICS now comprise more than 50% of the people of this planet. The United States is 4.5%. That's not close. Who's going to be surviving what if we do really stupid things to one another? I mean, this is elementary logic. You have to sit down with the Chinese and work out and the Russians too, a live and let live. Otherwise, you are going to be making one colossal mistake after another. Let Ukraine be the last bitter lesson. One final point.
Great point.
Because I too have to go. I'm sorry to say I have to go. One of the things I heard during the campaign was the argument from the neocons that if we don't stop Russia in Ukraine, well, then all of Europe will be threatened. You know, the old domino theory.
Yep.
Okay. I want to remind people there is no evidence that Mr. Putin wants anybody else. He can barely cope with what the Ukrainians are doing. Can you imagine if he had the French or the Germans or the Poles or anybody? I mean, it's silly. But history, again, is the best guide.
Mm-hmm.
During the Vietnam War, and again, you echoed it in the Afghanistani war.
Mm-hmm.
During the Vietnam War, if we don't defeat the communists in Vietnam, well, they'll be taking over all of Asia. Well, the United States lost the war in Vietnam. The communists of the North took over, and it's been a communist-run country ever since. What other country did they take over in Asia? Answer, none, never, not even a try. It's a make-believe. It's a scare tactic designed to get you to go along with something that isn't reasonable on its own terms, so you invent this other thing. In Afghanistan, the Taliban, who won, and the U.S. left and lost, did the Taliban move and take over other countries? No, not at all, nowhere. I mean, over and over, how many times before you can respond to these arguments by saying, either justify this war on the basis of what's happening here and now, or give up. Don't give me nonsense about how you can see into the future as to what there is, and we ought to take you for serious. You've lied to us. You've made this stuff up, and we're not going to believe it anymore.
And the same thing applies to China as it relates to Taiwan.
Yep.
If someone would please show me one statement by President Xi Jinping of China saying that he wants to invade Taiwan, I would greatly appreciate it, but you'll have a problem because it doesn't exist. Matthias said, just let the Russians have their imperialist ways. Matthias, what you need to understand is Russia is anti-imperialist. That's why there's the conflict. Because Russia is anti-imperialist. Look at what Russia did in a number of African countries in fighting for liberation for Angola and other countries in Africa against imperialism. Where is Patrice Lumumba University? It's in Moscow. So please, let's get our history, let's get our language straight, because words mean something. These are very important. Let me say, Professor Richard Wolff, my brother, man, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, as I told you, I appreciate these conversations. I get involved in them, but they are the way. They are the way to make the changes that I think we all understand we need, and we need them badly. So I salute you. And I do that really from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate that you have your program and that you do the kind of work that you do.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I greatly appreciate it. And again, it's guests like you that make it what it is. Kevin Baptiste, again, thank you for that super sticker. Richard Wolff, thank you for joining me today. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned. New episodes every day. Also, folks, please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. You can find all the links to the show below in the show description. Remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you again next time. Until then, I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a great, great day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.